Recording. All right, everyone. Let's keep going now that we've debated for 30 seconds the value of cricket versus baseball, which clearly cricket has won out in that debate. We'll talk about deforestation. Continue with our discussion on deforestation here. So today we're going to probably bleed over into the biodiversity material. Remember the quiz, which is due tomorrow evening, covers both chapter 7 and 8. So there's 5 questions on deforestation and 5 questions on biodiversity. And as I said before, right, both they're so closely interlinked. If you're cutting down trees, if you're removing habitat, then you're impacting the species that live there. So these two topics go hand in hand. We ended here. This is one of these general maps of human impact on a particular resource, and here it happens to be trees, right? So an estimate of the original forest cover. This is probably an estimate based on sedimentary records, pollen records. You know, this probably goes back 1,000 years, is my guess, to where we currently are, right, in terms of forest cover. And I made the point here that we have had an extraordinary impact on our environment in general, of course, but certainly when it comes to forests, that's clearly the case, and you can see that when you look at places like China and Central Africa and so on, right? So what I want to get to now is and there were some questions that kind of preempted this on Thursday. Let's take a look at why, right? Why are we cutting down trees when we know that trees are an incredibly important system regulator, both for climate, for the hydrologic cycle, as a habitat, for species diversity, for resilience to climate change? I mean, there's any number of reasons. There are also obviously enormous potential for income in terms of products that we get from forests, ecotourism. The list is long, right? I think there's a number of clear and very good reasons why we should protect these ecosystems. So what's going on? So there are 2 things going on here. One is, and I've split this out in the book like this. One is what we call the direct drivers of deforestation, right? Who is doing the deforesting? Sometimes these are referred to as the agents, right? The doers. Then we'll look at indirect drivers in just a little bit, right? What are the underlying reasons for deforestation? Then we'll wrap that up and begin to move to biodiversity. So the overwhelmingly most important, that was pretty badly phrased, but the most important driver of deforestation is the conversion to cropland and pasture, right? So if we think back to chapter 2 and we talked about food and we looked at that triangular map of the percentage of the surface, the land surface that's covered by crops and by pasture, those 2 are the most important direct drivers, right? Cutting down trees for crops, and cutting down trees to raise cattle, by far and away. And just incidentally, everybody, these factors and the commodities that I'm going to talk about in a second vary from region to region, right? So this is a general statement. Worldwide, that's the most important reason for deforestation. And that conversion to crops can take place at 2 scales, right? One is large plantation farming, so commercial scale conversion into cropland or commercial cattle ranching operations. And the second scale that we've talked about in terms of the herringbone pattern or the fishbone pattern of deforestation is subsistence farming, right? People who move around within the forest, they get access into a forest for whatever reason, however that happens, whether it's legally or illegally. And then they begin to cut down trees over small areas, a couple of hectares at a time, and then farm that for cash crops and for subsistence, right? So that's the first level of deforestation. Conversion of cropland to pasture, and whether it's large-scale plantation or subsistence farm. Now, under that umbrella of croplands and pastures, there are 3 commodities that really drive deforestation worldwide, right? These aren't the only commodities, but they are the most important. And part of this is the reason why this is so important. It's part of the reason why I chose the cover for the book, and you can see that in the top left of the slides here. That's the common theme, is deforestation. These 3 commodities are soybeans, cattle, and palm oil, right? Those are globally the most important commodities that are driving deforestation, the direct drivers or the agents, right? Soybeans are used for feed and a variety of things, including biofuels. Cattle and palm oil will come up to. Incidentally, what you're looking at here in this photograph is a palm oil plantation in Costa Rica. And if you go there, you'll see many of these, right? Clearly, this is a human landscape where you can see row upon row upon row of these palm oil plantations. All right, so let's just look at these three individually quickly. So soybeans is certainly the most important direct agent in South America. And Brazil, the Brazilian Amazon, I suppose, is kind of the focus area for deforestation. So that's what you're looking at here. On the right-hand side is a photograph of a soy plantation down in Brazil. On the left is a satellite image. It's been colored, so it's a false color image. And here, everybody, anything in red is forested area, anything in white is cleared. And you can go back and look at that diagram. I think it's 7.7 in the textbooks, where we looked at the total area of the Amazon, and you can see where this actually is. So this is not the herringbone subsistence shifting agriculture, right? This is large-scale deforestation and the conversion to soybean plantation. So soybeans, I would say, is certainly one of the primary drivers of deforestation in the Amazon. There was a moratorium actually put on soybeans from non-sustainable deforestation in around about 2006. The Brazilian government said, we are not going to convert any more of the Amazon into unsustainable soybean, and there was a moratorium on that. And that moratorium, incidentally, was a large part of the reason why we saw that continual decline in deforestation in the mid-2000s up to in 2012. That's now changed with the Bolsonaro government. That has been reversed, and it's very little restrictions on the conversion of Brazilian Amazonian rainforest back into soybean plantation. I think is kind of an interesting and very disappointing aspect. So soybeans is one major commodity. Cattle ranching is the second. And globally, if we were to take a sort of 35,000 foot look at deforestation, cattle ranching is the most significant, right? This accounts for something like 2/3 of all tropical forest loss worldwide. And most of this occurs in Colombia, Argentina, Paraguay, and Brazil, right? It's almost exclusive. So when we're talking about deforestation in the Ivory Coast or Ghana, or deforestation in Borneo or Indonesia, this is not cattle ranching. Right? Cattle ranching is almost exclusively a South American phenomenon when it comes to tropical deforestation, right? Both primary and secondary, if that makes sense. Any questions on that? So for example, when we look at deforestation in India, it has nothing to do with cattle ranching, right? Cattle ranching is big business in India, but they dairy cattle. And of course, the Indian people look at cattle very differently than we do, for example. Okay, so this is almost exclusively a South American phenomenon. Now, this diagram here, this is an important diagram, and this is about as high a resolution as I could get this at. It's from a website that allows you to look at various countries. And so what we're looking at here is obviously South America, right? And we're looking at Brazil over here, Paraguay, Bolivia, Colombia up on the right. So anything in red here is commodity-driven deforestation. So commodities would be soybeans, cattle ranching, and palm oil. Palm oil, much less here in South America. So red here is essentially cattle and soybeans, right? And in places like Paraguay and Argentina, that's almost exclusively deforestation through to cattle. Anything in yellow here, everybody, is shifting agriculture. So the yellow that are following the main trunks of the Amazon here that you see in the central part of the diagram, that is the shifting agriculture that leads to the herringbone pattern. Everything in red here is commodity driven, right? If that makes sense. Okay, so you can see the scale of commodity driven deforestation, at least in Brazil, okay? So there's Argentina, Paraguay, Colombia, and Brazil. Those are the 4 key areas when it comes to cattle ranching, and commodity-driven deforestation. So here's an example. This is deforestation on the Gran Chaco Plain in Paraguay in 2016. So in the bottom left, you can see Paraguay there. That little black inset box is the photograph we're looking at, okay? So you can see the Andes, part of the Andes stretching on sort of top left to bottom right. And all of these open areas are huge areas of tropical forests that have been lost and converted to high concentrated cattle ranching. And if you're trying to get a sense of scale, I'm going to put 2 dots on here. These 2 dots, the distance there is the distance if you drive from downtown Fort Worth to downtown Dallas, okay? So that would essentially be like driving on I-30 from here to downtown Dallas, and there would be huge cattle ranches on either side, right? Just to try and give you a sense of the scale of what's going on. So this is Paraguay, devastating, okay? So those are the first 2 large commodities, which are soybean plantations and cattle ranching. The third one is palm oil, okay? So palm oil are those plantations that I showed you the photograph of. And this has been devastating in this part of the world. Here's the island of Borneo, right? The 3rd largest island in the world. The southern part of Borneo is Indonesia. The northern part is Malaysia. And we've got a little bit there of the Kingdom of Brunei. And this shows forests in green in 1973 on the island of Borneo and in 2018, okay? And this is largely through the destruction of tropical rainforests and the plantations of oil palm. Now, the oil palm is not just for cooking oil, right? That palm oil ends up in so many products. I bet it would blow your mind the next time you go to Target or to Tom Thumb and you look at commodities on the shelves and what contains palm oil, from makeup to ketchup and anything in between, right? So this is a commodity that goes around the world into just a multitude of products. Again, if you're struggling for scale here, take a look at this. I've put Texas on top of Borneo, scale to exactly the same size, right? So Borneo is more or less the size of Texas. And that red blob in the right corner, that's an area that's been deforested just in the last 20 years, okay? So it may not look dramatic on a satellite image or on a map like you see here, but that's essentially all of East Texas, okay? Certainly not all of it, obviously, as you go further south, that doesn't include places like, you know, Livingston and Liberty and down towards Houston. But that circle is essentially an area that's been cleared just in the last 20 years, just on Borneo. I was amazed and I suppose privileged to be able to see this when I went to Borneo back in 2015, and we did a trip up into Kota Kinabalu and to see just the devastating effects of deforestation. So on the right here is a palm oil plantation from Borneo. This is a monoculture, right? So it's one crop and goes in. And we know that monocultures are less diverse than the tropical forest. So you can see the tropical forest off to the right. And it's not a happenstance that you see those clouds and the evaporation coming off the tropical forest, much less so on the palm oil plant. And it's a cash crop. On the left-hand side here, anything in black, in that sort of charcoal black shading, are palm oil concessions and some pulpwood, some logging concessions. But for the most part, it's dominated by palm oil, right? And the link here, folks, is not just losing forests and losing wood, but we're losing habitat, right? Something like 100,000 orangutans have died over the last 2 decades as a result of the conversion of tropical forest into palm oil. So pretty devastating for sure, okay? So those are the big 3 commodities: soybeans, palm oil, and cattle ranching, driven both by plantation, large-scale agriculture, and subsistence farming. Just coming back to a second for another direct driver, shifting agriculture, right? So the subsistence farming is certainly very important in many parts of the world. And this is, as I showed you with those yellow areas in the Brazilian Amazon. So we cannot ignore these shifting agriculturalists that lead to the herringbone pattern. On the left here is a satellite image taken of the Brazilian Amazon. Again, where that is shown in an earlier diagram in the chapter. And each one of these red dots is a cluster of fires, and there's a photograph to go with it on the right-hand side. So this is an area that is about 2, maybe 3 hectares that's being cleared here. This is the slash and burn, right? It's being cleared, burnt down to try and get the nutrients into the soil so that the subsistence agriculturalists can plant crops. Incidentally, everybody, on the left here, this area at the top, these are clouds. Anything down here in this sort of wispy white is a series of forest fires. You can see all of the areas surrounding there are deforested. Again, just for a sense of scale, there's Texas, right, overlain on the Brazilian Amazon. I always think it's important to just sort of get a sense of the scale of a particular environmental issue. Okay, another commodity that's very important, of course, is wood products. Okay, so when we think about the big three, the palm oil, the cattle, and the soybeans, wood products clearly are an important component of this. And this generally comes down to either pulp, so cutting down trees for paper, or timber. Okay, so logging concessions being sold around the country. Still important in many parts of the world. Here's a very important one in Africa, for example. So the deforestation that we're seeing in Central Africa, a large part of that comes down to illegal logging for pulp and for timber and for people cutting down trees to sell as biomass or charcoal. Remember that there is this paradox of productivity in a rainforest. We tend to think, I've mentioned this, but I wanted to just show you this visually. The reason why shifting agriculture is so destructive to the environment and to forests is that after a couple of years, those nutrients are washed away. Okay? They cannot get into a tropical soil. So on the right is a very typical tropical soil profile. This is taken in Hawaii, an area that's been cut down. And this is very typical, right? You don't see that buildup of rich, dark, organic material that is so important to the fertility of the soil. On the left-hand side is a typical prairie soil. This is in Nebraska. And you can see how rich and dark that soil is in terms of being able to grow crops. So there's this interesting dichotomy in the soils of temperate mid-latitude regions versus tropical soils. Remember, the reason for that is that all those nutrients, that cycling goes on very close to the surface. Please go ahead and read that case study that I've written there. I won't spend tons of time on this, but if you do get time, please go and read that short bit that I wrote on Costa Rica. I've referred to this country a few times. I don't know if any of you have been there. If you get a chance to go, please do, this remarkable place. One of the reasons I like to just mention Costa Rica here is that it really is, from a deforestation perspective, I think it's an environmental success story. So this is a series of maps that have been drawn off aerial photographs and subsequent satellite imagery, where you can see the area of Costa Rica that was under primary forest and how that really was decimated right through until the 1990s. By the late 1990s, Costa Rican forests had been cut down to the extent that something like 25% of Costa Rica's forests remained, all right? They had lost 3/4 of all of their forests. Here we are in 2021. The 2020 data show that coverage has gone back up to more than 50%, right? There has been an enormously successful drive by nonprofits, Costa Ricans, farmers, the government, to begin to reforest Costa Rica. Part of that is through ecotourism. Part of it is through wealthy private individuals, state parks, government setting land aside. But Costa Rica really is an environmental success story, right? It's one of the most diverse regions in the world, as we will talk about when we get to species diversity next. One of the great success stories, I think, in Costa Rica, and again, read up on this in your own time, is the government in the early 2000s came out with an interesting program called the Payment for Ecosystem Services, PES. I don't know if any of you have heard of the Payment for Ecosystem Services, but what it was is that it was a government scheme where they would pay landowners to keep their forests intact, right? So for every hectare, you would earn something like $65 to $70, I think is the current rate. It started off higher than that, but currently it's about $65 to $70 per hectare, right? Per year. So that doesn't sound like very much, but if you had, 100 hectares, then that would start to add up pretty quickly if you're a farmer or a landowner. And so people have made some pretty good money just leaving their forests intact. All right, so let me stop there and see if there are any comments or questions before we go on to indirect. Make sense, everybody? Okay, good. So why is this happening? Okay, what's behind this? And we lump this under the indirect drivers. Okay, so what are the underlying reasons? Okay, so this is complicated, right? This is not a very simple story as to why countries are losing forests and why they cut down their trees. I think at a first level, a lot of people, I think, argue that it comes down to poverty and overpopulation, right? So countries that are poor, they cut down their trees to raise money. Or countries that have very high population densities, they're cutting down their resources because they, that's what they have and it's closest to them. And that link between poverty and overpopulation and forest loss is not as clear and as simple and straightforward as you think, right? For example, here's a repeat of the diagram that I showed you last week. This is the top 10 countries losing the most tropical primary forest, right? So if you take DRC, the Democratic Republic of Congo in Africa, DRC lost the second highest amount or aerial coverage of primary forest in 2018, 481,000 hectares, okay? And the DRC has a high population, and that population is expected to explode. It's going to be one of the highest rates of population increase through to 2100. If you go back to chapter 2 and you just look at that diagram that I did there on the top 5 countries of population growth, DRC is right up there, right? There's about a 300% projected increase in population. Okay, so it's a high population country, high population density. It's a developing nation, they're relatively poor. And so you would say, well, that seems to be a pretty straightforward link, right? But Brazil, which has the highest rate of deforestation in the world, doesn't even come inside the top 150 countries in terms of population density, right? So my point is, it's not a simple and straightforward link between being poor and overpopulated, whatever that means, and rates of deforestation, right? It's much more complicated than that. And what I've got here is just some of the complications, some of the complexity, right? One of which is the unequal distribution of land. So in Brazil, for example, let's just look at Brazil because this is the country that is losing the most forest, right? So Brazil, 3/4 of all of the agricultural land is in large multinational corporations, right? Large commercial agricultural operations. 3/4 of all the agricultural land. 1/4 come under what we call small family farms, right? So there's an enormous disparity right there in terms of who's doing what, okay? And when you look at just who owns land in Brazil, I think the number is, I'm not going to ask you to remember this percentage, but it'll give you a scale, something like 1%, right, of the people who own land in Brazil actually own something like 50% of it, right? There's an enormous disparity between the haves and the have-nots, right? So what I mean by unequal land distribution is relatively few people own the land, and that's why shifting agriculture, the slash and burn agriculture, people don't own the land, right? So that's one complexity. Western consumption, okay? What's the link between Western consumption? Well, when we buy hamburgers, if those hamburgers come from land that has been deforested and there's such a drive towards Western lifestyle and Western diets, then that's a very important indirect driver, right? Corruption is certainly one of them, undoubtedly. Certainly in South America, that's been an enormous problem. And profit-driven multinational companies. All of these things play out into a very complex picture. Added to that is many of these countries are sitting there under the sort of pressure and the crushing inability to pay international debt, right? Brazil has, $560-something billion of foreign debt that it can barely pay back the interest on that, right? So selling logging concessions or trying to raise cash in the short term is certainly an important part of that. So the drivers, the indirect drivers, these underlying reasons, everybody, are really complex. So what do we need to do? Let me end off deforestation here, and then we'll stop and see what your thoughts and comments are. I think there are two things as we move forward. And just incidentally, I think 2019 and 2020 are going to look very bad for deforestation for a number of reasons. One is, obviously, we need to try and preserve as much as we can, right? And we're seeing this around the world. So Costa Rica is a great example of success stories, either wealthy individuals or nonprofit organizations buying up tracts of land and preserving them in state and national and private reserves, right? We have to obviously pay attention to the question of edge communities. That's very important. Remember, edge communities is when you have a fragmented landscape. How do you then rehabilitate that landscape and reduce the boundary effects or the fragmentation of landscapes? So that's one important, I think, need. Preserve as much as we can. And at the same time, how do we address the economic needs of these nations in which the tropical forests reside, right? I mean, most of the tropical forests are in countries that are still developing, and yes, a lot of things are improving, but you know, a country like Costa Rica, which is a much wealthier Central American country, relatively speaking, it still struggles with deforestation, even though they have a lot of success, right? So we have to take into account what are the economic and environmental constraints of a particular country, right? To what extent are Western lifestyles driving what we see on the ground in these tropical countries? So here's my sunset slide for deforestation. This is again an image from the island of Borneo, and everything that you see, these terraces, these are all palm oil plantations. So let me stop there and see if you've got comments, questions, thoughts on the direct and the indirect drivers of deforestation. I hope these coffee beans are from a sustainable, non-deforested part of the world. Any comments, any thoughts? All good, straightforward. Well, not so straightforward, but important. Okay, all right, that's deforestation. Are we doing on time? Perfect, 20 minutes. Let's move over to biodiversity and why we should care, okay? So here's what I want to do. I'm going to introduce you to some important concepts up front, and then we will stop there. And then on Thursday, we will come back and explore biodiversity and begin to move deeper into issues of species that are endangered and threatened, and who gets to choose which species live and die. Now, that may seem like a really harsh and cold statement, right? But that's part of the reality of where we are with 7.8 billion people on the planet, okay? Unfortunately, the Cliff Notes version is this. There isn't enough money to save all the world's species, okay? Well, that's a bit depressing, but that's the reality of where we are, okay? So once we get through this material here this morning, on Thursday, we're going to come back and talk a little bit. We'll touch on this issue of environmental ethics again, right? And, you know, why am I involved in a rhino conservation project? Why do we tend to see rhino conservation, elephant conservation, leopard conservation, and yet no one seems to be starting a, you know, save the eel or save the snail or save the zebra mussel, right? How do we balance which species get to live or not? Pretty complicated stuff. So biodiversity. Okay, so we see a lot of headlines, right? As we do with a number of environmental issues, climate change and so on. But this is common, right? We're causing the 6th mass extinction. We're losing species. Scientists say that we will, you know, that we've lost 2/3 of the world's species. These headlines are here to stay, and they can be a little numbing. So here we go. Before we even talk about what are we going to save, let's think about how many are there, right? How many species are there in the world, right? The number of species is relates to this notion of biological diversity, okay? And biodiversity, of course, doesn't just mean simply the number of species. There's a whole other set of qualifiers. How are they distributed, right? Are there some common species, some rare species? But let's try and answer this question. How many are there? Well, we don't know, right? We do not know, excuse me, how many species there are on the planet, okay? We know that there are somewhere between 1.7 million and 1.9 million species that have been identified, cataloged, named, and put into some taxonomic scheme, okay? Depending on which catalog you look at, it's probably nudging up to about 1.9 million species. So that's the first thing. Those are the number of species that have been identified and named. About 2/3 of those are invertebrates, right? Okay, so that's one point. To try and address the issue of how many are there, estimates vary enormously, okay? So we have to look at the fossil record, how many have lived in the past, how many do we find every year? And this is not just a question of, you know, Indiana Jones going out into some remote forest finding, oh my goodness, here's a new species. DNA has really unpacked species diversity, as I'll show you in just a second. I think the consensus among entomologists, among biologists and ecologists is that there are probably somewhere between 5 to 8 million species on the planet, somewhere in there, right? The oceans are still vastly unexplored. So somewhere in there, we think would be, you know, is it 3, is it 5, is it 8? It's probably not 50 million. I think the ecological consensus is somewhere in the region of 5 to 8 million. North America is biologically diverse only up to a point, right? Somewhere in the region of 10 to 15% of these species live in North America. So we're not a particularly diverse part of the world, as we'll talk a little bit about. Okay, well, this is what I mean by DNA, unpacking species diversity, okay? We scientists thought that there was just one species of giraffe. I love this animal. I don't know if any of you have seen giraffes in the wild. These are the most beautiful creatures, I think. Recent genetic studies show that there are 4 distinct species of giraffes. And so that's what we're seeing every year, more and more species being unpacked because of giraffes, because of DNA. All right. So, very important map here. I would bet that you would see this again sometime soon in the not too distant future, okay? So let's talk about this map and what it is showing. So this map is global biodiversity, not mammals, not animals. This is the number of species of plants, right? So what we see here, just look at the legend for a moment here. This map divides up the terrestrial land surface into these diversity zones, and they're expressed, everybody, as the number of species per 10,000 square kilometers. So anything in red, these are the most diverse zones, more than 5,000 species per 10,000 square kilometers. In other words, one different species for every 2 square kilometers. Down here in the yellows and the light greens are the not very diverse parts of the world, okay? We've also got ocean temperatures in dark gray, so greater than 29 degrees Celsius, greater than 27 in light gray, just as a frame of reference. In this map, I want to hear from you. This is the kind of question that I would put in the exam. And so what's going on here? Discuss. What do you see? Yummy little exam question on the 6th of May.
It's more diverse in the tropic.
Why? Yep.
Because there's a lot of forest and maybe there's more habitat for them.
Okay, so let's just put I'll put H up there to remind me. So habitat, right?
There's more precipitation and higher temperatures.
Okay, good. Why is that important, Lauren?
Well, precipitation is important for plants. Obviously, they need plants to survive, or they need water to survive, and then the plants are eaten by animals. And so more plants means more animals. And the temperature is important because it's easier for animals to survive in warmer environments.
Right, so there's a climate footprint here, or fingerprint, right? Optimal climate conditions. You would imagine that species would thrive where they have access to water. Water leads to habitat diversity, like tropical rainforests, where temperatures are moderate. Species don't have to evolve and develop resilience to, I mean, it's a little more comfortable in Costa Rica than it is in the Canadian Arctic, right? So that kind of intuitively makes sense, right? So yeah, precipitation, rainfall, optimum climatic conditions. Yep. What else do you think is going on? So basically, let me just put it up here. Latitude is an important control here, right? Latitude, where you are. And the tropics, so this is 20 degrees right here. 30 degrees is right there, right? The term the tropics and the subtropics are generally about 30 degrees either side of the equator, right? So the tropics and the subtropics are somewhere in there, more or less, okay? They seem to be much more diverse than the higher latitudes. Is latitude the only control? And if latitude was the only control, what would this map look like? Well, there's another good example. If latitude was the only control on diversity, what would the what would the map look like? I'm getting too caught up in the exam. If latitude was the only control. What would you expect to see if latitude was the only control? Or someone point out to a part of the planet where latitude is not the only control.
In Europe.
In where?
In Europe.
Europe?
Yeah.
So there you're saying latitude is a control then?
I said it isn't because like you can still see some green and blue part.
Okay.
Australia?
If latitude was the only control on diversity, wouldn't you expect, let's just look at Australia. You would expect high diversity there, then you expect a horizontal line and it would get a little lower, and a horizontal line and it would get even lower, and a horizontal line and it would get lower and lower and lower, right? If latitude was the only control on biodiversity. But it's not. Sorry, I didn't see who said Australia.
I did.
Okay, Sammy, keep going. So clearly latitude is not the only control here, right? You've got parts of Australia where you've got high diversity, okay, and parts of Australia where you've got low diversity, right? So we've got high diversity here on the East Coast. This is actually a subtropical rainforest, high diversity here, not so much here.
Is it near the ocean?
So how does that control things, Ben?
It stabilizes the temperature.
Okay. So ocean currents are important, right? Ocean currents, warm ocean currents, cold ocean currents. Okay. Yeah. Stabilizes temperature. So here's a cold current, cold Peruvian current. Okay. It's coming up the west coast of South America, and look along the coastal regions here. This is very low diversity, yellow right along the coast, right? And then, what is that?
Aren't there mountains there that kind of block that cold air from getting onto the other side?
Okay. What mountains are there, Holly?
I don't remember.
No, you have to remember. Geography 101. What are they called?
I don't remember.
The Andes.
There you go, the Andes, yeah. Right, those are the Andes. So the Andes Mountains. Anybody see any other mountain influences here? What are these? I can tell you these are not the Andes.
The Himalayas?
Yeah, look at the Himalayas, right? We've got this very narrow band of very high diversity, yeah? And even if we come back to the US, look what's going on here. Someone explain this little horseshoe that's going on here. What's up with
those mountain ranges are the Rockies and the Cascades and the Sierra Nevadas.
Okay, so what's going on? Good.
It's like, I just know that mountains have a really big like weather effect on our land because they create valleys. Like we talked about in one lecture, that when it gets dark outside, there's like this cool air that rushes down on the valley and like the warm air rises.
The mountains have a dramatic effect on climate, right? You get lots of rain on one side, dry air on the other, okay? What mountains do is they take this thing, right? And what do I mean by this thing? They take this thing called the latitudinal diversity gradient, where we have high diversity in the tropics and the subtropics and lower diversity to the north. And if you want to see that diversity gradient in action, I just need to find, I just need to find the annotator. Here is what I mean by the latitudinal diversity gradient, okay? Let's go here to Central Mongolia. We're in dark green, then we're in light green, then we're in lighter green, then we're in yellow. You see that? That is, it's not absolutely mimicking the lines of latitude, but it's pretty close, right? That latitudinal diversity gradient, that gradient where we see high diversities in the tropics because of habitat, climate, and other things, which I'll mention. Mountains take that high diversity in warmer climates, warmer, wetter climates, low diversity in colder, drier climates, and they take that and turn it vertically, right? Where you're down in the foothills of a mountain, where you go up to the top, you go from warm, wet, moist to cold and dry. Here's an example. I don't know if any of you have been to Hawaii or if you've been to Maui. Who's been up? Okay, Keegan, I see you nodding. Have you been up Mount Haleakala?
I actually have.
Cool. What do you remember going up from the base of Mount Haleakala to the top, what the climate and what the landscape looked like?
Oh, it's been such a long time.
It's been a long time?
Yeah.
You actually go through 9 of the world's 12 climate zones. You start at the base and you're in tropical rainforest and you've got pineapple plantations and it's all groovy and people are surfing and playing golf. And you go up to 11,000 feet and you're basically in the northern Arctic of Canada, right? You've got some scrubby tundra, it's cold and it's dry, okay? So that latitudinal diversity gradient, which is one of the great patterns that we see in ecology, is lifted vertically when it comes to mountains, if that makes sense to everybody, right? So when you look at the diversity map that you see here, yeah, the tropics are diverse, right? And the tropics are diverse because not just because they're warm and moist and create optimal habitat. That's true, okay? But the tropics are also diverse, and I see the chat. I'll get you in a second, Teresa. It's a good question. The tropics are also diverse. This may seem odd to you, but it's another actually really important part, right? The tropics are diverse because of the fact that we're sitting on a sphere, okay? So if you look at this band between 30 degrees north and 30 degrees south, everybody see that, right? If these are the tropics, 30 degrees north and 30 degrees south, okay? That area, if you physically calculate the area around the Earth at 30 degrees north and south, that area constitutes half of the surface of our planet. And you go, wait, what? That doesn't make any sense. What about from 30 degrees to 90 degrees? Well, we're on a sphere, right? So the area of land gets less and less and less as you go around the planet from the tropics to the equators. So the tropics are not only diverse because they're warm and moist and have optimal climates, but there's a lot more land area there in those optimal climate conditions, right? So that pattern that we see is known as the LDG, the latitudinal diversity gradient, that gradient of high diversity in the tropics to lower diversity in the poles. And I'll come back to the mountains in a second. So for example, 2 photographs that I've taken, right? Here I am in the Monteverde cloud forest of Costa Rica looking up, and here I am on the Vatnajökull National Park in Iceland, right? Which of those 2 areas is more diverse? Well, the Monteverde cloud forest, right, has thousands more species than the glacial park in Iceland. It's not that the park in Iceland is any less or more beautiful, right? Here we are in the tropical rainforest. Here we are in a more of a sort of subarctic tundra environment. The latitudinal diversity gradient absolutely comes into play. And we can see that by the data that's been collected around the world. So this shows the latitudinal diversity gradient. Here's latitude from the South Pole, close enough, to the North Pole, right? So we're going from Antarctica, tropics to the Arctic. And here's the number of species, okay, of birds, right? So this is the latitudinal digradient. where it's highest in the tropics and lowest in the polar region. There's obviously a lot of scatter, right? Depending on where you are. You can have a small island that's rocky and volcanic in the equatorial regions and have low diversity. But the overall trend, this shows American mammals, right? Going from latitude, okay? In the northern hemisphere here, southern hemisphere on the right. So this pattern that looks like a normal distribution, where you get higher species in the tropics and lower species towards the poles, this LDG is real, right? This latitudinal diversity gradient is absolutely real. Teresa, let me just look at your question. When you say that the mountains turn a latitudinal diversity gradient vertical, do you mean it rotates 90 degrees? Yeah, in effect, that's what I'm saying, right? It makes it go vertically upwards, okay? Does that make sense, Teresa?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, cool, right? So here's another example. Hang in there for a couple of minutes. Here's another example of latitude, again, not as the only control, right? Let's take a look at why the tropics are really kind of the cradle of diversity. So here's the island of Borneo, right? Here's the island of Borneo right here. And I've drawn Borneo to scale to North America, okay? So here's Borneo. There it is there in small. We've just talked about that with deforestation and palm oils. Here's North America, okay? Okay, in 15 hectares or 37 acres of Borneo forest, there are about 700 species of tree on average. That's the same as the whole of North America. Pretty impressive, right? Borneo also happens to be home to the world's tallest trees, okay? The yellow Meranti, which is twice the height of the Statue of Liberty. So tropics are absolutely the key when it comes to biodiversity. Does that make sense to everybody? Okay, I'm actually going to stop there because that's a really great place before we launch into endangered and threatened species. Questions, 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 comments, thoughts? Everybody good? Okay, cool. I'm going to stop the recording there.